Hello and welcome to Meta Ethics. Today we're here again and we're talking about bullshit jobs. So we both recently read the Daniel Graeber book.
David
Graeber book. We'll talk about the subject and digress into many other things as usual.
Yeah, so I just for the record, like probably you guys have heard, like David Graeber passed away this year. So for me, at least, that was an impetus to kind of read the book. Like I'd heard about the subject matter, amongst sort of leftist circles before, but it really gave me that drive to like go out and read it. And I think just to like before we get into the content, like, did you enjoy like the writing and everything? What do you think of his style, like his prose?
I thought it was very easy to understand, which is a huge benefit. He's not constantly referencing other philosophers that you haven't read. So there's, I feel like there's a common issue in these non-fiction books where you always feel like you need a larger and larger knowledge base to understand anything. So it's entry level in that sense. The only person he really references is like Marx, occasionally. And well, as far as like enjoyability, I found the first third extremely boring, but then way more interesting after that. Once it gets into all the anecdotes, it's extremely interesting. The first third is he's mostly talking about different kinds of bullshit jobs and putting them all into categories, which is just not the most entertaining thing.
I think in a way the structure of the book is a good sort of synecdoche, if you will, for Graeber's like overall style, in the sense that he's finding this midway point between being academic and being accessible. So like you say, like the prose is very straightforward, but he's also not like talking down to the reader, and he is trying to make, some of his other books are more sort of academic, like Debt the First 5,000 Years, and I had a bit of a read of The Utopia of Rules, which just covers similar topics of like bureaucracy under capitalism, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But so the book itself is structured with this typography. I forget the term, but he delineates like 5 different types of bullshit jobs, which we'll get into, and then there's the anecdote. So I just feel like that's kind of representative of like generally what he's trying to do. Like it really is accessible. Like it started out as like, I think the book started as like a blog post, and then people would respond, and he sort of like was able to build up this database by like, getting people to talk about it. But I actually really do, I think that's important, because I do respect that part of the book, that element of the book, like quite significantly. Like it's, I don't know, it's just trying to reach people, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think it's also a topic a lot of people can relate to.
Exactly.
I know I haven't done that much working in my life, but one part that I found really interesting was, so I've worked at like a few retail places, and there's this constant sense of having to pretend to work. So I've worked in a fruit shop before, and you're always, looking busy. I even got sent out to the back to do an absolute bullshit jobs where I would like rub the excess skin out of the onions, but like not even that well. I guess just because they wanted to give me something to do. Otherwise it was kind of like hiding out the back or sneaking away bits of food, but then once you've filled up the store, there isn't much else to do other than pack it down. And I've worked at a tech shop before too, which is, sometimes there's no customers, or a customer comes in and is just looking around. So you're like doing completely meaningless rearrangement of where everything is, just because you don't want to have the boss breathing down your neck. And so fairly early on in the book, he talks about how it used to be a really, really absurd idea to buy someone's time, because these days it's all like, you're on my time, even if there's no work to do, you should be doing something. Whereas in, let's say the medieval period, you could only buy a service. Or you could even buy the person as a slave. But that would be completely different to buying their time.
Just in terms of anecdotes, I recall I did a very similar thing with onions. I worked in Woolworths in a city, and the kind of mental, I guess, like games you kind of play with yourself to keep things interesting. It wasn't really a bullshit job. It just had elements of that when it was daytime, and I did have to like kind of pretend to be busy because my job was really like in the Nightfield. Then it was like absolutely not a bullshit job, very busy, but I would kind of devise in terms of like hygiene and like the aesthetics of like the vegetables or whatever, like you develop these like sub-routines that just kind of like of looking busy, of like, oh, I need to, the onions, I mean actually I found this pretty satisfying, but like removing excess skin or whatever, and that was something I like, it got to the point where that was something I would like look forward to. And the other thing was I would devise ever more brazen ways of like stealing things.
We had at the food shop I worked at, it actually used to be a different shop, but then it got bought up by the new company, and a bunch of the old workers kind of got screwed over. So I think this guy was a little bit jaded, let's say, but he knew where all the cameras were, and he would like tell us, oh, you can take this and eat it out here.
Wow.
And he was a great bloke.
And I think this points to like a trend in the sense like of what...
This is all fiction, by the way. We've never committed any crimes.
Oh yeah, this is all in a video game.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's like you can have jobs that are sort of bullshit, like substantively, like the whole or most of the job is like not engaged in any sort of meaningful work and is kind of pretending to be busy. But also Graeber identifies a trend of increasing bullshitization. So the process by which like ordinarily useful jobs are increasingly, their time is devoted to these less meaningful activities. So one obvious example would be something like paperwork for teachers. This is something I know about from my mother being a teacher, and just anecdotally. It's also something Mark Fisher talks about in the text Capitalist Realism. He talks about as a university professor, you can see how is tied in with this capitalist logic, and it gets to the question of like bureaucracy under capitalism, because capitalism is meant to be the force that's like anti-bureaucracy. You know what I mean? That was like a hallmark of like the Soviet Union, and so that's something that's kind of pointed to as like I mean, aside from obviously like the genuine like all the deaths and everything, but as in terms of like to make the point that the system can't like sort of logically work, not just like this historical instantiation had various, I don't really like the term excesses because I think it's a very it downplays like horrific crimes, but just for lack of a better word. But the point that people want to make is also that structurally some kind of post-capitalist or socialist system like cannot work, and so one of the things they'll point to is this bureaucracy, right? So in terms of and I think it's sort of particular to neoliberal capitalism, but when you extend this logic of competition to something like schools, you need some kind of metric to measure that by. You need to take an abstract idea of progress of the student's competence, and you need to come up with a value that represents that. So this is where the bureaucracy comes in, is we need to find elaborate ways of like generating these values and better schemes, data entry. That's something I know my mum has done a lot of, and she'll often want to offsource that to me. She'll offer to pay me to do data entry for her because it's it's actually it's simple work, but when it's diverting from actually planning out your lessons and doing things that that you signed on to when you applied for that job and decided to embark upon that career, it can be quite taxing, especially since that's actually done in her case in her own time, so she's not even paid to do all this data entry stuff. So yeah, like the key point there is that the need to create metrics of measuring these things and entering education into this sphere of competition, which is kind of the underlying logic of neoliberal capitalism in this case, like leads to that need to create more paperwork.
I think that's a really interesting point. It's kind of interesting. It's obviously, in some sense, a very different book, but I'm reading Homo Deus at the moment. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and he did sort of at length remark about your average mark in school and how meaningless this all is, and it used to be you either are competent and you get your degree or not. Also, similar to your teaching data entry, when it comes to lawyers, now I think it might all be online, but they used to have these humongous books called practices, which is essentially a book that has every law in it in a particular field. And my sister would get paid to just basically how it is there are clip folders. You open it, you go to a certain page, you take out the page, and then you update the page with the new laws. And it's just a really tedious task that's probably not having a huge benefit overall, and is supposed to be done in the lawyer's time too. And also, I mean, in general, it can be quite the misconception that lawyers are always paid well. But in general, I would say lawyers are paid better than teachers. And I had a teacher in year 8 that told me if you added up all of the marking he was doing and everything he was supposed to do outside of teaching the lesson, it would have actually been more profitable for him to work at McDonald's.
I would just like to make a brief point, or maybe amend them to what I was saying about data entry, or just an addition, which is that this data is not often, this is just personal anecdotal experience. This doesn't, necessarily explain like anything systemic, but in terms of my mother, like she will often have to input data that's been written down on paper into a system. So there's an extra step there that is like, I'm unclear as to why that's even there. But I wanted to sort of broaden my thesis from earlier, because we also need to bring in the topic of sort of specialization. So there's this feature within bureaucracies, which you can see if you just read like a Kafka novel or something. And even I was just recently rewatching some older Michael Moore documentaries, like Fahrenheit 9/11, Capitalism: A Love Story. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of his films.
I have. We watched it in high school actually.
Oh yeah.
But I can't remember which one it was. But I know the style.
So let me. One thing you may remember is like there's often and this is sort of a sub kind of feature of a lot of his films that I think is maybe just not like always sort of commented on, but he is encountering a very sort of Kafkaesque world. Like he is trying to sort of speak truth to power, and in the case of his first film Roger and Me, it's about like all these auto car plants being moved out of Detroit, off-sourced from like Flint, Michigan, and he's just trying to basically elicit compassion and kind of just like just get some answers really, because these people at the top, are incredibly unaccountable kind of thing. So it's always he's trying to encounter this authority who's at the top, but he must go through, as it happens in a bureaucracy and it happens in like a Kafka novel, is it's always, you have to go through like the lowest down person in the chain. So the issue is that the power is so decentralized that you have, what can the person at the bottom really do for you? This is like you go to the store and there's an issue with your burger or something at McDonald's, and you complain to who do people tend to complain to? Like maybe they'll get through to the manager. Sometimes if they're a particularly shitty person, they'll just abuse the person who's like working the cashier. But even the manager is not like they're not in charge of, they're just like as in the grand scheme of things, they're like a middle manager, you know what I mean? Like when I worked in fast food, we had a store manager, then we had the franchise manager, there's all these chains of command, and each one has a certain amount of responsibility they're able to take and a certain amount of power. Yep.
So there's a wonderful talk that I would recommend literally everybody to watch. It's about quite an unrelated topic. But it's called An Elephant in the Hospital, and it's about circumcision. And the talker is a great guy, and near the end of the talk he says that he tried to do something about the topic. He essentially debunks every point in favor of circumcising children. And he says he went to the hospital ethics board and they just sent him somewhere else. They said, oh, there's nothing we can do about this. And it's just like, who else? You know? No one seems to have any power. In other documentaries, like even vegan ones, such as Cowspiracy, they people just avoid answering questions, or there's little will to change anything.
There's no accountability, and the only authority with which you can even physically interact, because generally the CEOs are sort of cloistered away, you don't really, unable to fully interact with them, are precisely the people who don't have the power to change things. Do you recall the anecdote in the book where he's talking about his dying mother, and he's trying to get Graeber, that is, he's trying to get like Medicare?
I think so, but you can explain it better.
It's kind I forget the details, but basically he's kind of running around. The person who tells he has to fill out this form and then go take it to, I want to say, the bank or something like that, and the person who's with him helping him fill out the form, like, tells him to. He fills out, it's like their name and year, and they're like switched for whatever reason. Like, he fills his name in the year and he puts his the year in the name category, and the person who's helping with the paperwork says, like, that's fine to do, and he like should do that. He goes to the bank and then they say, no, that's incorrect, and he has to like keep going back, and meanwhile his like mother's dying, you know what I mean? Like, they just want to get support for like the last couple months of her life or whatever, but it just becomes this kind of farce, and no one is that central figure of power. And I think another great example would be like a call center or something like that. If you ever had to like get tech support or anything like that, you'll know it's very decentralized and it's very specialized, and as such, like, I can't speak to the economics of this, but there is a way in which it generates its own inefficiency. If we're talking about the logic of capitalism as being like efficiency maximizing, like, I'm not sure that that's what's happening here, because how many times are you just left on the phone on hold for 10 minutes only to, or longer, only to pick up, and then the next person is the wrong department, and so on, and you're just waiting, and no one is provided, because of this specialization, which is a hallmark of capitalism, as it's meant to kind of relates to alienation. So Marx's critique of capitalism on the basis of the alienation caused by specialization, but just in terms of inefficiency rather, that's a core kind of concept, and so sorry, I lost track of what I was saying there.
Well, I think one thing that we never really get in the book, which I'd be dying to know, and how would you ever find out really, is like, what do all these bosses think of this? Like, they surely on some level they must know that they're just bleeding money. Like, it's impossible to understand. And those are the examples that I find most interesting in the book. There's plenty of examples of, like, as you said, these jobs generating their own inefficiency. But there are so many examples in the book of jobs that simply do not need to exist at all. People that go to work simply to pretend to work so they can live and not starve to death. One particularly striking example is when they have a programmer that comes in, and his job is supposedly to essentially find redundancies and increase the efficiency of the workplace. And he finds a group of employees, and he gets a meeting with all of them, and basically says, for a much cheaper price than what they're paying the employees, he can create an extremely simple computer program to do what they're doing, and the idea is instantly rejected. They would rather just hire these people to do nothing.
Yeah, sorry, just to recall my point, because I sort of like dropped it a little bit there. Yeah, it's this decentralization makes it such that similar to the case of the authority figure, the information is so decentralized such that each person is only trained in this incredibly specific, component of, whatever it is you're trying to get help for. And yeah, that means you're constantly kind of bounced around, and it's just like, it's just very strange. But yeah, I mean, a big sort of takeaway from his book, like he's identifying, it's on the phenomenon of bullshit jobs. So his main aim is sort of just to diagnose, to determine, whether there's an issue, what the issue is, and maybe some of the underlying factors that have sort of led to this point. And really, like, because you were saying about sort of like, it is just filling people time, like they just want to have people on the payroll or whatever, like, his argument is that that's a big part of it, that there's this need to have people, this economy of, obviously not entirely, but this, let's say, like a sub-economy of like bullshit jobs, in order to just sustain faith in the system of capitalism. But it doesn't. The problem here is that capitalism isn't willing to accommodate its own actual end goal. Like if it's, if we're leading to a point of abundance, like we have the market, which is is supposed to allocate scarce resources. Like what happens to the function of a market when there is abundance? Like there is no scarcity. Like what happens to the point, even in some digital media where you eliminate scarcity? Like what then is the role of a market, kind of thing? And so I think, in different ways, like there's ways to be more sort of technologically deterministic about this. Like when Marx is talking about like the grave diggers of capitalism, he is talking about, yes, structurally capitalism engenders this situation in which, workers are put next to each other in factories, and their the specialization works in their favor to some extent because they're the only ones who know how to, like, the factory is a very sort of cliched example, but they know, they're the only ones who know how to operate the machinery or whatever. So yes, it's creating the conditions, but then they need to obviously, like, go out there and organize, kind of thing. So I don't want to be too technologically deterministic, but there is like a seed of its own, of the system's own destruction in the way that it's able to, with automation. And so there has to be some kind of solution to overcome that. And maybe we can talk about like UBI, but it's kind of more of like a band-aid or like transitional solution. It's because there's obviously much more psychological and like spiritual, if you want, problems with like, what do we do when there isn't even enough work to sustain, a 40-hour work week for everyone? Exactly.
And I mean, I would say there isn't, even without eliminating bullshit jobs. I mean, in Australia, I can't remember the exact statistics, but if I make them up, people are always quoting, there's 200,000 unemployed people and only 100,000 jobs on Seek. People are obsessed with this, frankly, completely delusional idea that anyone can just work themselves up to wealth. Most of the jobs we're doing now don't even need to exist. Like, maybe people will consider this too radical, but like once you really read the book and think about experiences in your own life, like people talk about, a 4-day work week. Like, if we decided to go for efficiency, if we eliminated all the bullshit jobs and maybe got all these unemployed people to, maybe share a bit of the workload, we would be working like 2-day work weeks, 3 at max. Honestly, like probably less. But we live in a system where you either work or starve. It's this ultimate contradiction. People don't seem to understand. Like, it just makes absolutely no sense. Did you read the Libertarian responses to the argument of bullshit jobs? So, essentially, I feel like we should get this out of the way before we start taking to conclusions. So, the Libertarian responses to bullshit jobs tend to be in 2 categories. The first is that, yes, there are bullshit jobs, but it's only in the government field. I mean, that's just completely disproven by the anecdotes in the books. The second is that there is no such thing as a bullshit job. It's just that everything everybody works to create a very small piece of the puzzle in capitalist society, so we don't see the meaning our jobs have, which I feel like is also debunked. I mean, for example, the guy that said, oh, we could get rid of these 25 people and was told to shut up about it, or many people in the book that literally just go in and pretend to work. Like, there was one guy that just spent his day at work editing Wikipedia pages because there was no work for him to do, or the work that he did do was done in 20 minutes. I mean, that's another example. Like, maybe some of these people are working real jobs that really are important, but the work can be done in 20 minutes, yet you're still expected to be paid by the hour. So you can do, if this job takes you 20 minutes a week, you still have to come into the office and, quote unquote, work for 40 hours a week. But what are you doing? You're sitting there playing video games, editing Wikipedia pages. A lot of these jobs you're not even allowed to read or, let's say, listen to a podcast. So you're essentially sacrificing time that could be spent doing many much greater things.
I think one aspect that maybe we haven't touched on is like what leads someone to be stuck in a bullshit job. Excuse me. I don't think it's necessarily just like that's the last line between them and starvation. It's sort of a higher salary. Like, it's this trade-off. I mean, a lot of people will sort of make we don't tend to know people who are sort of have entered the workforce yet, as a result of our age, but people will describe themselves as there's kind of a disavowal that goes on. Maybe it's just the people I know, but when people are going for more sort of business, like jobs that aren't particularly, engaged with like trying to help people or seen as particularly meaningful, they kind of feel the need to disavow it and just say like, yeah, I understand that, but I'm doing it for the money because I know it's going to have like a high salary. There's no, I mean, you could intrinsically enjoy that work, but no one ever like I say, could just be the people I meet, but they never say that. It's always like, no, I'm sort of knowingly making this sacrifice.
I would say that's definitely 100% true, but I just do want to bring attention to the point that in the book there are several examples of people that intentionally quit their high-paying job to go to a lower-paying job, which I don't want to say is more meaningful, but just less meaningless. And yeah, of course there's going to be the other case where people will take a meaningless job for more money, but I feel like this can kind of segue into the point that some people will say, oh, you should just be grateful to have a job. Like, I would love to not have this really difficult job. I would love to go to work and not do anything and get paid. But there's actually quite a lot of suffering in pretending to work. And that also kind of relates to another point in the book, where there seems to be an inverse correlation. And there's obviously plenty of exceptions to this. But on the grand scheme of things, when you think about all the small jobs, janitors, etc., it seems very true that there's an inverse correlation between how important your job is and how much you get paid. So like the CEO of Woolworths could disappear, and that would obviously have a negative effect, right? But if all the but things wouldn't collapse as they would if, let's say, everyone that stocked the shelves would, or the truck drivers would.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the point I sort of was trying to articulate earlier, in the sense that, like, if you're kind of one step away from poverty and this job is the only thing holding you back, like the only thing, your only safety net. The reason those don't tend to necessarily be bullshit jobs is because, as you say, the lowest paying jobs tend to be more sort of, it's funny, they may not be meaningful, but they at least clearly provide some benefit to society. I think obviously individuals vary widely in like what what tasks they find meaningful, but something like cleaning, and this is or something I meant to mention earlier when you referenced lawyers, there's a fantastic section of the book, I want to say like chapter 5 or something, where he's talking about what is the phenomenon, like what historically the factors that have led, this point in time, because he says like there's been bullshit jobs throughout history. There's been people, kings and so on, who want to kind of, whenever there's like wealth and it's concentrated towards the top, and there's a clear divide, there's a need to sort of buy off the middle section, have sort of useless retainers of people, not only to provide yourself with some sense of importance, but literally kind of making them continue to be invested in the system. But in terms of the point about lawyers, he has this section where he's breaking down statistically the amount of social value, and I don't quite recall how that's defined in this case, but like he's using a monetary unit. So something like, when people talk about like private versus single payer healthcare in the US, and they say like how much money would be saved if you were to kind of switch it, like it's that kind of thing where like so he says medical researchers, it's about 8 to 1. So for every dollar in wages a medical researcher receives, they create $8, I'm guessing, just for the economy in terms of value. Teachers are also in a positive value and everything like that. Lawyers actually come out in his actually I don't think they're his statistics, at negative value. It's something like I think it's only a fraction. I think it's like 0.6 or something like that. So not terrible, but his point, it's really more a point that they're probably being paid more than the social value that they generate, not the value that they just sort of generate for their clients, but like what is the broader impact on on the wider society. And of course he has, hedge fund managers and, people in the financial sector who, do fall further in this sort of like negative category.
How about the banking? Like this was mind blowing to me. So from one person high up estimated that, and even if you don't believe this statistic, that's fine. But considering how high it is, it must be incredibly high, even if it isn't this high. But he did say that 80% of jobs in the banking sector were entirely bullshit or could be easily replaced. And that was phenomenal to me. And I don't want to backtrack too much, but you did mention single payer healthcare versus private. Like you must remember it. How insane was that Obama quote?
Yes. Do you want to explain it for that?
Yeah. So I think it was in an interview where Obama was being asked about universal healthcare, and he essentially admitted that they could have universal healthcare. His point was just, we would lose this many jobs from all the insurance people, and like people are dying, but just having these jobs is deemed way more important. And I think this is really like the exemplar of like, we're living in late stage capitalism. Like, what is going to happen, Like, are we just gonna keep creating these meaningless make work jobs, pretending to work, money just flowing out of the air? Like this is insane. There are already so many bullshit jobs, but there are people that are, like dying in the gutters, unable to feed themselves or their families. Like, we need to have a different system where you aren't like reliant on work, or you don't have to work 48 hours a week, or like there has to be something else. Like, the more examples that go in the book, you think of like, oh, well, we could get rid of this job. We could get rid of 80% of the banking jobs. Oh, but what would happen? We can't do that. People need to work. But do they? I think a big hurdle to like finally overcoming our system is, he talks at length. To be honest, it was a little tedious. It was like, I got the point, and then he keeps talking about it. But how work came to be seen as something like that's virtuous, simply work by itself, even if it doesn't produce any value. you'll eat your bread by the sweat of your brow. Um, he talks about the Puritans and the transformation from work as just something that needed to be done to like this kind of, self-delusion of, like both punishment and redemption. I think that's a phrase he uses actually.
Like that sort of Protestant work ethic. But I do think now we've sort of shifted. It's sort of a hybrid in a way because we are concerned about sort of the output of this labor. We care about consumption and we care about, some of us conspicuous consumption or having a nice house or having a nice car. Even if these are sort of self-defined in sort of more, I think it's easy to sort of fool yourself sometimes in sort of like these utilitarian terms of like, I kind of need this product. It's not that I want this product, it's that I need it. And there are a lot of very practical products. If you're into, I don't know, camping and you want to get like specialized camping gear, like capitalism's fucking great at making like this high-end, like genuinely amazing gear or whatever. If you want to be in, sub-zero temperatures, like we can accommodate that, you know what I mean? But, one example I think would be something like health, where what is the kind of end point? As you're buying more organic, whatever, like kind of nice food, like you can justify it in terms of health, and it just kind of keeps going. Like, but seriously, like, could the money not? Is there not a point at which the money could be spent better elsewhere? And so, even though I think I'm sort of critiquing part of this utilitarian logic, we can come at it from another angle of like the Peter Singer argument of like, well, why not donate that money? And this is not me shitting on people wanting to eat healthy, but I'm just saying that general principle, like, when you see people with multiple cars and multiple houses, but I'm also going to hold myself back here because I think this is sort of a trap in a way, because I think it's a very moralistic kind of liberal way. Small L liberal, so left, ostensibly left on the political spectrum, in terms of how we think about like kind of distribution under capitalism. So there's kind of a pop or like common sort of version of this when we talk about something like food, you know what I mean? We understand that capitalism has this amazing ability to, really generate like a substantial amount of wealth, but it doesn't, necessarily nail like the distribution. So something like food, like we know we have a shit ton of obesity, in the first world countries, and we throw out a fuck ton of food. But there's people who, starve, in the cliche, in Africa or in, Southeast Asia kind of thing. So the distribution system has kind of broken down. And like that, I'm not quite sure how that's seen by liberals, but let's say something like money, having an excessive amount of wealth and spending them on these ostentatious, commodities and houses and so on. It's taken as this individual moral problem. It's like, yeah, you have 4 cars and you don't drive any of them, but it's, you should just donate to charity. But like, not only is it obviously like we respect your personal freedom of choice, but that's kind of the solution. It's not framed in terms of maybe we have some gesture towards like progressive taxation or whatever. But I do think that moralism is itself like a problem.
I'd like to know your thoughts on like, what do we do? Like, should we get rid of these bullshit jobs? Because I feel like most people don't enjoy going to work. Or they would at least rather spend their time doing other things. So if we can get people working 30 hours a week, that's better than them working 38 hours a week. So where do we take, once we have the knowledge, where do we take it?
Yeah, I'm definitely for a reduction of the work week. It's difficult because that seems not to be a trend. Like, what the establishment or like what, you can't remain blind to this problem forever. To an extent, that is what happens. Like if you look at something like the 2008 financial crash, you have a problem with kind of, in 2004, I want to say, the FBI released a memo saying there is a, the word wasn't pandemic, it was something to that effect, of mortgage fraud. going on in the American housing market. So that's 4 years before the crash. They know there's an epidemic of mortgage fraud. So almost in the way that it happens on an individual psychological level, I think there's a lot of sort of repression, and I think we learn to repress in a lot of ways, and this probably goes beyond capitalism, because we've something we talked about before with like children and their response to finding out, you know, meat is an animal product. This process of repression happens where, or so, you know, in sociology you'd call it the rather sanitized term like socialization or something like that. You learn to conform to the standards and the morals of the society in which you were born. So that entails a certain amount of repression, the stuff you have to kind of push away and push down. I forget what my exact point was there. It's a bit of a tangent.
Maybe someone similar to meat. I would consider this kind of another form of a bullshit job. It's sort of is similar to what Obama was saying about, you know, we need to have these jobs in healthcare. People often get furious at vegans, like farmers especially. Like, what am I supposed to do with my livelihood? Like, this is my job. Like, we farm animals. It's completely meaningless, right? Like, we grow grains that we could eat, but instead we feed the grains to the cows, and then we eat the cows and get sick. But so at some point, the world is going to have to greatly reduce their animal product consumption if we're going to live sustainably. Like in the documentary Cowspiracy, they talk about, okay, well, what actually is sustainable? And it's like this tiny glass of milk is what every American could drink a week, like a few milliliters, if we were going to be sustainable. And I feel like at that point, dairy is already like dead, right? Like, farmers can't make a profit, and they're begging to be saved by the government. But what are we going to do with all of these farming jobs once we get rid of animal products, right? So I know in Finland they had some program where they transitioned dairy farmers to berry farmers, but like, I mean, is that reasonable to transition every animal farmer to like a berry farm? Like, how many berries are we going to eat? Most fruits already get thrown in the bin. So I think that's another sector of work that is, if we decided to make things more efficient, there's just going to be a bunch of more homeless people or people that can't get work. And so I feel like this is a point where, you know, we need to start talking about alternatives, right? Like, it's really basic. Like, there are people that can't get work. There is simply, we live in a society where the premise is you work and you exchange that for, you know, goods and services, and you live and everyone's happy. But there just isn't enough work to go around. Like, we need another system where people aren't reliant on work, or something where people don't work, and maybe like for 1 year of your life you're sent off to do, you know, maintain all the farms and everything. But on the other hand, it also frightens me because I don't know, like, what do people do when they're not work? Like, something that I've never really understood about communism is, like, I watched a video by the YouTuber Spooky Scary Socialist, and he talks about how in communist societies there can be this great eruption of art, but like it doesn't really make much sense to me. Like, is everyone gonna sit around painting? You know, I just don't really understand.
I mean, I think it's important to point out at this point that, like, you know, to all the boomers out there, we're not against, like, working hard or anything like that. Like, it's just, you know, what is the sphere to which you of life to which you kind of apply yourself? You know, is it your 9 to 5, or is it your side hustle, or is it your, you know, hobby that you happen to find meaningful, or, you know, any number of things.
Exactly. I'm not against work. I'm not against suffering in that sense, but I'm very against just the meaningless work, meaningless suffering.
Yeah. I'll give an attempt to re-answer the question you asked before I went off on a tangent. So yeah, what is to be done, which is kind of the theme. Yeah, I mean, I guess you sort of articulated it like a reduction in the work week, like a sort of a distribution. But yeah, I mean, some jobs in the United States, you've got millions of trucking jobs that are subject to automation, as Andrew Yang is often talks about, or at least subject to partial automation when they're on the highway and so on. Maybe not in big cities. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tough question.
Yeah. Well, we can start. So let's say we overthrow the government and end up in this supposed like utopia. What do we do all day?
I mean, I don't believe in utopia. Like, I think any system.
Well, when we're not at work all day, what do we do? Do we get together in our friend groups and go to the beach every day?
I mean, that's it, right? That's the profound challenge of that system. Do you see what I mean? Like, capitalism has, if you're at the bottom, has some profound challenges, both, external and psychological. And so I think that there are worse problems to have, to not know what to do with your free time.
Yeah.
We can still allocate the labor, Marx kind of talks about like this thing of, not being stuck in one particular role. Like if you want to pursue a career, it's true that, I think in terms of sort of being a jack of all trades or choosing one, career to stick on your whole life, that's obviously a personal choice. And it's true that, some of the people who I admire most, who seem to have achieved, greatness in their fields, have really kind of, stuck at it and, done a particular thing and not necessarily been like multidisciplinary as such. But yeah, in terms of, just kind of, he describes a situation in which you would basically be jumping between different jobs that you're obviously qualified for and everything, but you could be taking out the trash on Monday and fishing on Tuesday and that kind of thing. I think more leisure. People will invent different cultural kind of forms. It could be new kinds of sport. It's kind of because I think people have a lot of kind of repressed creativity, right? They don't find an outlet for it. If you're not pursuing it as a career, it's not always deemed as entirely valid, or we have this sense of hobbies as being kind of I don't know, just kind of frivolous activities on which to fritter away your time.
I guess there is kind of a point in that, because in our society everything we do is supposedly we got to make money. So if we live in a society where we're not working ourselves to death, potentially art is perceived differently, because the struggle of musicians, how am I going to make a living out of this, or any other artist really.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I just gave a satisfactory answer, so let me dig into that a bit more.
Sure.
It's also to do with kind of allocations of resources. So in terms of, let's say, state funding, which we know, in Australia we give millions of dollars every year to the fossil fuel industry. I know Elon Musk, not critiquing this particular aspect of his work exactly, in terms of Tesla and working on these, autonomous and electric cars. He receives subsidies. There's a point about research. What do we research under capitalism within this framework of the profit motive? So you have we had NASA, who sent humanity to the moon, and subsequently now that's being done by the private sector. but that's something we've kind of abandoned. And I've talked about this before in terms of like stems, like what are the most, let's say the world of medical care, like what is the most profitable way of distributing our resources in order to, like, what diseases specifically. So let me be really concrete about this. Something like baldness has like a shit ton of funding because it's going to make a lot of money. Like obscure kind of chronic conditions, the government will allocate funding towards that and try to deal with that, but it's not going to be profitable when you can't kind of like roll that out. Do you know what I mean? You need to basically create like a fake profit motive. Take something like corona, in order to get the distribution right, in order to have it so that obviously we need everyone to get vaccinated. We need to create basically a fake profit motive, in the sense that, like, through the use of these subsidies and everything. Otherwise, the only way it would be profitable to create a vaccine for Pfizer, AstraZeneca, whatever, would be to jack up the cost at the point of purchase. But there's a book, I think it's called Selling Sickness. I'd have to look into this, but it talks about the misallocation of resources within kind of research and where that's kind of going. He talks about, there's many chapters each on a different subject, one of which is about statins, which are used to, like, I believe, like stabilize your blood pressure or something like that.
Yeah,
it's probably a simplification.
They're also used for like high cholesterol.
That's probably it. I probably misspoke. But something like, and it has a kind of parallel to like what antidepressants and things like this, where they're really overprescribed because basically anyone is going to like benefit from being on a statin. So people, doctors will just like prescribe it all the time, and it's just like that's creating money.
There are a lot of fair criticisms about the documentary What the Health. It's another vegan documentary. But they do honestly make good points that these companies, drug companies, let me just be very clear. There are a lot of wild claims people make about the health benefits of a plant-based diet, but one that I think is beyond a doubt absolutely true is that a whole food plant-based diet can essentially, it's the only diet to have ever
cure cancer.
Well, to have ever reversed heart disease, or some people, if we want to take it like real mild approaches, because I know many of the viewers of this won't be vegans, it's at the very least one of the only diets to prevent heart disease, which is the leading cause of death in every Western country. What would all these, cholesterol drugs do? What would all these companies that make them do if everybody went vegan and we just cured heart disease?
There's another interesting kind of point about inefficiency. Let's say to take something like obesity, we've developed this kind of I forget the word, in terms of selling fucking diet supplements, gym, gear, whatever. There's this whole industry, this sort of sub-industry around health, whereas like, why couldn't there just be some kind of like government or health program like on the just this really basic level, kind of the way it's left up to the individual? Sure, it like promotes like individual choice, and I'm not saying like force people to exercise or anything like that. I'm saying give them a public option. Or bit of a tangent here. I'll just finish this point to try to get back. But something like, healthcare, where engaging in prevention, it's like we talk about like poor people don't have the means to consume in a way that is sort of, when you're having like buying like fast fashion and kind of cheaper clothing that genuinely isn't as high quality and long lasting, but they don't have the means to buy an expensive pair of shoes that is like, it's expensive because it's well made, because it's going to last a long time. So they're forced into this cycle of buying shitty stuff.
Being poor is expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So something like healthcare, where if you don't, if you don't have public healthcare, you don't want to go in for these like checkups or whatever for kind of prevention, and then it gets pushed later down the line and the burden on the system becomes a lot larger because the problem has now gotten worse.
I feel like the task now is for the anti-capitalists to get a clear idea and propose like a strong alternative to this. And then that's all there is. Like, once we know where we can take what we have, then there's not much else to do. Like, we know that we're essentially wasting time. I think you made a good example that, like, you know, once we dispense with our capitalist society, we can essentially set goals all together, you know, research stem cells or explore other planets, you know, do whatever we want to do. We just need to get rid of, you know, valuable people sitting in offices for 40 hours a week pretending to work.
Yeah, I think I wanted to really make clear my point about sort of technological innovation, because I think capitalism is not always the best driver of it. It really depends on what kind of innovation you're talking about. You know, like let's take the example of like the internet, or of GPS, or of all the constituent parts that go into making an iPhone. You know, these are all technologies that were some of them were certainly like military technology that was then, you know, made available to the public. But the point being, it was generated through the public sector, like through the state. And then, you know, it's a bit of in a sense, a low-hanging fruit, but, you know, the iPhone 8, the iPhone 9, the iPhone 10, culturally speaking, like, what is it with all these remakes, you know what I mean? Like, this insane, like, remake culture.
The Disney live action.
Yeah, or these Avengers movies, you know what I mean? Like that's capitalist innovation, right? Like, I'm not saying that's how it's always characterized, but at this, you know, historical standpoint, like, to some extent, some of it has been funneled into this very, you know, repetitive, like, let's just play it safe kind of thing. Whereas when it comes, because I understand it, I actually get that. It makes sense in terms of basic R&D, like when let's say you're trying to discover a new concept in physics, or synthesize a new element or something like that. Like, how the fuck do you know if that's going to be profitable later down the line? So it's reasonable, you know, you could have a liberal kind of paradigm in which the state takes care of the basic R&D, and then, you know, the private sector turns that into commodities. And I think they're certainly, you know, good at that, you know, making it like a kind of consumer commodity. But yeah, in terms of research, I think if you follow only the profit motive exclusively, like, and if you leave that R&D to the private sector, it doesn't lead you in very sort of helpful places. It leads to, you know, I guess it's a truism, but profitable places.
Yeah, and as far as innovation, like, yeah, okay, if you're coming from a well place.
For our viewers, I've just placed the my tea mug on the microphone.
Yeah. That was, I don't know, you did it quite gently. Like, that could potentially not come through. But it's like the slightest tap is just gonna, like...
Don't tempt me, man. Don't tempt me.
Yeah, true. Okay, but you know, like... how many people, like, can't afford a patent, or, like, have fantastic ideas but can't implement them? Like, the creator of the fidget spinner, which of course was an insanely big fad, that was like a single mother of a special needs child, and she couldn't afford the $400 patent. So, how exactly was her innovation rewarded? And how many people could have come up with a similar idea but just didn't have the money to, or the free time to, because they were at their bullshit job?
You know, what we do is, I'm using language, I guess, from Marx, but it's kind of been popularized by, like, or I take this from David Harvey, who I'd highly recommend if anyone hasn't heard of him. He's I guess you'd say, I believe he's actually trained in anthropology, but yeah, he talks about the idea of like use value and exchange value. So what we have under, capitalism is in order to obtain things to define the terms, a use value is something, you use for its explicit purpose. So I use this mug to drink tea, and exchange is something like, well, I don't actually need this mug of tea. Maybe I produce mugs of tea. Maybe I'm a amateur crafts person in my spare time. So I have surplus mugs of tea. So then my use of them is their exchange value, right? Because I'm going to exchange them to other people. What we do is we mediate use values through the exchange value system. So something like housing. It can't just be housing. It has to be this source of investment, and it's determined by kind of market forces as to whether you can obtain like something that you really just like kind of need on some basic level. And this also gestures towards the destructive power of kind of like financial capital. Like, the reason the housing market was this source of speculation. Like there's a Matt Taibbi article on the GFC that covers a lot of this, talking about bubbles and specifically the role of Goldman Sachs actually in 20th and 21st century in terms of making all these financial bubbles. But, moving from not just like financial kind of assets, but to like, I forget the word, but stuff like oil and housing, so more concrete. And the problem is like that system of profit fucks up the system for like just getting the things, your kind of basic necessities. What is the system we have now? It's like housing prices are seen to go up indefinitely, which is fantastic if you're an asset holder and terrible if you just need a house to live in, kind of thing.
Yeah. We've basically gone over everything that I took notes on, but the one thing that I wanted to talk about was, this is something I know a little bit, but not a lot about, so maybe you can fill me in. He talks about how, like, so he basically says that the labor theory of value used to be, like, universally accepted before the fear of communism. So, like, I'm wondering, like, could you talk a bit more about what that is?
That's a fantastic point in the book. Really, like, these little details that I think Graeber puts in that just makes me like him as a writer. It doesn't really necessarily strengthen his political point, but he talks about the Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is a Humphrey Bogart film, I believe. And the opening scene, it's because he was talking about how it used to be so, like, he talks about Lincoln having to gesture to, like, explicitly basically talk about the labor theory of value in his speeches. Whether or not it was his own personal conviction, the point is it was such a truism at that point, you kind of couldn't not, espouse that view. And so in this movie, what they've preserved is the fact that in the kind of like, I want to say it's like kind of a Western, like cowboy kind of setting, like, I guess like miners and that kind of thing, like the labor theory of value was also entrenched in that community and that culture, rather. So
yeah,
that's something that's always written out of the history. So this movie, Treasure of the Sierra Madre, the opening scene is someone explaining the labor theory of value.
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, I remember he mentions the actors.
Super interesting. Labor theory of value states basically that the source of value is labor, which is pretty simple, but is also pretty very controversial in a lot of ways, and is counter to our current narrative about something.
Supply and demand.
Sort of supply and demand. It's interesting. It's very central to.
Well, if I put, like, let's say 100 hours of work into writing a poem that's complete garbage, like, how valuable is that poem?
Well, there's basically a, one of the strong objections is basically we don't talk about art in a sense, like, as in, I'm not saying like, as in that's an excellent objection, but his work around is just like, these things are genuinely subjective, so therefore we shouldn't, we can't really stipulate about them in this way. But another example would be, what if you're a particularly slow worker? So he incorporates, he says it's the socially necessary labor time, so it's to do with the standards of that society. So if a society has a certain level of mechanization, maybe not automation, but you can work with machines in part of the process, and it only takes an hour of human labor to build a mug. Like, that's what it's worth, as opposed to if you had to build the whole thing by hand, if you're in an older society. So it's like the value of things does change over time, but according to how the means of production are able to come to a production process that is more or less efficient. I think he accommodates for the idea that it could be different in different countries, but yeah, that's the general principle. And then there's issues like land, where if it's uncultivated, but it's a scarce resource to some extent, no labor has come in to appropriate the land and like sort of better it, in the same way that if you come across a piece of wood and then you carve it into a shank or something like that, you've inputted human labor. So raw material plus human labor, you create something of value that someone may want to buy or you're going to want to use. Like, the question of how we value land under this labor theory paradigm is a good question. And I think there's sort of like, more modern Marxist economists who would expand it or refine certain elements of it to incorporate for, a genuine scarcity, for instance. If you were in some kind of emergency, like a flood or something, and there was a scarcity of, food or something. Although, I mean, it's worth noting, like, that's a more philosophical point, right? Because we're talking about value, not price. So I was just thinking, like, in the event of that specific instance of scarcity where it's more isolated, it's not like the continent, let's say America, the continent of America doesn't have enough, bananas or whatever. It's that micro situation, and we actually have price gouging laws, even in a country like America. Pretty free market capitalists, they have price gouging laws, but that refers to price, not value.
I guess they can somewhat be synonymous in today's time.
Exactly, because we don't. And yeah, the reason it's so central is because that's how he accounts for the extraction of surplus value, from the worker in the process of production. I don't know. Do you want me to go fully into that? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so like, in terms of profit, Marx states that in a way, all profit is I don't want to say theft because it's encountering sort of a moral judgment, but let's say, which is kind of reasonable, but let's say the word uses exploitation, and I do think it's worth pointing. Actually, this was a good point made by is it Unnatural Vegan?
Oh, God.
I hate to say it, she made a good point. It's a different definition. It really is a different definition under Marx. And to be fair, I'd say it's pretty poorly defined just in the general term of like what is exploitation, but consider it like part of Marx's lexicon, you know what I mean? Like the worker works, let's say 8 hours a day, they're producing products that by definition have to be sold more than, the amount of labor that went into them. So, let's say the seller, what I meant to say is it's more than the wage they're receiving for the products they produce. So if you work in a factory 8 hours a day, you get like $20 an hour. What's that? $160 for a day of work, right?
But the person that's paying you sells your product and makes more than that.
Yeah, because otherwise there could not be a profit. And that's really true of, like, this isn't really just a Marxist interpretation, maybe the term exploitation you could say, but like profit can't come from nowhere. And so Marx's view it is appropriated from labor. And yeah, Graeber, he seems sort of ambivalent in a way. I think he takes sort of the central premise, like we should think, we should be skeptical about ways of generating, kind of in the financial sector, just kind of moving money around, making bets, speculation. We should be really skeptical about, all of that. But I think he has a whole book on the subject, which I haven't read, called An Anthropological Theory of Value. So I feel like he probably has more to say on that topic that isn't, entirely addressed here.
It's kind of interesting. Bullshit jobs seem almost a counter to it. Because let's say you work and you produce something that's of value and your employer sells that and takes that surplus value. You have a bullshit job where you go in and pretend to work. you're not producing anything of value, or you're producing very little, and you get paid like substantially more than the value that you produce.
I think that's a really good, really excellent point, because it runs extremely counter to the logic. Like if you put this to a, even pro-capitalist people would argue this kind of perverts the spirit or logic of capitalism, which I disagree with. But there's it's kind of like there's like a meta layer of logic of capitalism that's at play here.
I would love to know what like an ardent capitalist thinks the solution is.
Yeah, well, the trouble is getting them to acknowledge the problem, because as Graeber points out, and I haven't raised this, but I have raised issues. I've taken economics, like an economics class before as a just a single unit, and I raised the issue of automation, and it was kind of just shot down in a very cliched way of
Right.
that more jobs are going to be generated, which I don't think is necessarily even. Okay, I don't want to say ever, but the tendency has been for, yes, new jobs are created, absolutely, but less new jobs are created. You know what I mean? Like, think like, in like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, like his dad works in the toothpaste tube factory, and he, at the end of this film, he gets laid off. That's a big kind of drama. And at the end of the film, he gets a job repairing the machine, and it's like, oh, everything was okay after all. Like, sure, he got a job repairing the machine. What about the rest of his comrades? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, not everyone can fix the machine. It obviously takes, like, way less labor.
Otherwise, they wouldn't build the machine.
Yeah. And Graeber talks about this. Sometimes the tendency is to, once again, I don't know what they would say if they actually accepted the premise, but I think a common tactic would be to deny the premise, because it's kind of hard to follow that all the way through. It's something like, okay, before I make a wild analogy, I think it leads you down a path that's slightly uncomfortable. And this is what I was talking about, like capitalism being uncomfortable with, like, or unable to fully grapple with the consequences of its own productivity. Like, we're leading to this endpoint of scarcity. Like, it's supposed to generate abundance. It's supposed to be a great economic system for generating wealth. But then it can't sort of survive the point at which we overcome the need to, the scarcity and the need to kind of hoard wealth, in these little pockets of, like the upper stratum of class, like the 1%. But so it's like, what do we do when we reach that point? What do we do when we have amazing technology? We're able to automate, heaps of manual labor jobs. Just take the realm of like music for a second. Like, we have like infinitely replicable digital files. High fidelity digital files that like don't lose any quality as you copy them, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's no scarcity there. Everyone can just consume as much music as they want, but there's a need to, in order to not have shit tons of unemployed musicians, to have the system of place where we pay for, and now it's become the right to access the streaming service. So it's no longer necessarily about the physical medium. Like, you can go out and buy records and CDs, but in terms of like iTunes, no one's going into fucking iTunes. I hope maybe some boomers out there, and buying an album for $15 just to have the download of it.
Yeah.
Except where you really love the band and you want to support them. I get that. Please by all means do that. But what I'm saying is, it's capitalism in this case has sort of innovated away its own profit-making ability. And this is what Marx talks about with like the falling rate of profit and everything. So yeah, it's a tough question. Like, to force them to sort of grapple with their own logic and kind of the endpoint. Like, could capitalism conceivably innovate away itself? And that's why it's like the point about technological determinism. Like, I think that's my tendency is like somewhere is sort of angled towards that in a way that like maybe some leftists would like strongly disagree with, and like fair, like we should fight for things. I wanted to make the point about climate change, just in the sense that like there's a need to deny the very existence, and maybe you could make this argument for coronavirus. It leads you down a particular road like so far, to accept the way capitalism has been like pretty antithetical to like the health of the environment, and how the profit motive just doesn't really take these things into account. And there's even flaws within like capitalist logic of itself. Like here's the thing: you can critique capitalist logic and say like, yes, it's sort of it's consistent, it's eternally consistent, but it's an amoral system. But there's points at which it's not even internally consistent. Like externalities would be something like that. So when you should be forced to pay, like if you're causing harm to others through your activities, like, if you're polluting the river or something like that, like that's an externality. Like there needs to be some way within capitalism of like dealing with that. I don't know exactly what the theory on this matter is, but something like a carbon tax just kind of makes sense, because you're literally like impinging, if we're talking about like individual freedom, which it's tricky because like liberalism or libertarianism or the ideal of freedom, it's not quite the same as capitalism. Just like democracy is not the same thing as capitalism. You can obviously have a capitalist democracy, and some people might say that as somewhat oxymoronic, but the two can coexist. But the point about individual liberty was that's obviously curtailing people's individual liberty, and just generally allowing anyone to amass like Bezos level wealth ends up impinging on other people's individual liberty when you use that to control the political system, buy newspapers, shit like that. But just to finish up here, the point about climate change is there's a need to like deny its very existence for some subset of people, because if they really thought about it, I think it would lead to some kind of, I mean, for me it's anti-capitalism, but for certainly like a radical like reorientation of like their political worldview. So they must reject the very premise.
And yeah, I think the exact same thing for bullshit jobs. Like this is something people will just block out, because
they'll say in principle it can't be true. Like capitalism wouldn't allow it.
It's pretty circular logic. Exactly how you've described it. But once you accept the premise, the only logical conclusion is that massive systemic changes have to be made, and we can't, rely on like the premise of capitalism just in principle always striving for the most efficient way and the way that benefits humans the most, because as we've seen in the book, it's simply not true.
Any final words on the subject?
I think that's basically all I have to say.
Likewise.
Right. Just one thing. Like, share, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff.
Up for it.
See you in the next video.
Over and out.